All right, mic check 1 2 1 2. Who out there listening to this right now saw both Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. while watching UFC 291? And by the way, no spoilers. If you guys haven't watched it, I'm going to give you some spoilers right now in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you have been fully warned. So, Justin Gaethje gets a head kick knockout on Dustin Poirier, and Terrence Crawford beats down Errol Spence in a one-sided beating. So that's what we have going on tonight. Now, let's just make sure we have our mic check on, just to hear what the mic sounds like. In a one-sided beating. All right, so the mic sounds perfect. Yes, that was an absolutely one-sided beating in terms of a high-level championship boxing match. The way that this matchup was marketed, it was marketed as to say that, you know what we got going on here is a situation where it's a 50-50 fight. And if that is so, well, then why did the fight look like the way that it did? And I think there's several aspects that we can really look at and try to understand and pinpoint as to why the results came out the way that they did tonight in what you would expect from a 50-50 fight. And that is simply just for the simple fact that, number one, let's take a look at the factor of Errol Spence getting into a car crash. Are we going to act and pretend like none of that has a factor into his performance? Now, he looks like a lion in front of, let's say, Marky Garcia. He looks like a lion in front of Danny Garcia. He looks like a lion in front of Ugaz, while Ugaz was coming off of beating Manny Pacquiao. And by the way, shout out to Manny Pacquiao. He was in a stance that night, along with many other boxing celebrities and all types of celebrities out there. On the UFC side, you had Karl Malone, longtime Utah Jazz staple of the NBA, attending the fight in the UFC side. And then lo and behold, you had Eminem walk out Terrence Crawford. I literally had to lower down my UFC volume because I had two screens up only so that I can watch Eminem rap Terrence Crawford out to the ring, in which he didn't really rap him out. He just walked out with his song, and here I am. I'm Eminem. Yeah, you guys know that I performed this song. I performed this song multiple times in multiple cities. I'm probably going to go to another city tomorrow and perform this song over and over again. I just wanted to show up for the fights, watch this matchup going on, and in full confidence know that my pick, Terrence Crawford, is the best boxer in the world. And lo and behold, that's what happened. So a couple of things you got to understand about Errol Spence going into this fight, right? There's some psychological matters that I think is really important to try to understand. And that is, for one, when he was in a Mike Tyson podcast, he mentioned something to the effect where him and his dad went to a boxing gym in Houston, and he mentions that it was like an all African American gym, but the work ethic in that particular gym wasn't really all that good because of the fact that they just sat around and listened to music all day. And this was the accounts of Errol Spence Jr. when his dad took him to that gym. So they went to a Mexican gym in the same area of Dallas, where he's from. Sorry if I said Houston earlier, but by the way, speaking of Houston, how about Derek Lewis with the win that he had tonight in the heavyweight division? He's ranked number 10 in the heavyweight division, takes on Rodrigo Lima, who was number 15, and then comes out with a flying knee early on and then knocks him down and finishes off with a ground and pound. Now, going back to Errol Spence Jr., there's a discipline issue that I'm trying to talk about here. Now, is he a talented fighter? Yes. Here's the thing. You can be a very talented fighter in any particular combat sports, whether that's boxing, MMA, jiu-jitsu, and everything above. That's perfectly fine. The thing is that you have to understand coming into this combat sports game is that, yes, talent can get you so far, but then there's a certain point where there's somebody that's maybe less talented than you that works a little bit harder, that grinds and can take you out based on the fact of their work ethic coming into their camp or coming into the preparation of the matchup they have against you. And that's kind of what we have going on here. But with Terrence Crawford, what you're witnessing is an absolute exceptionalism in terms of not only talent, but also in hard work and dedication. This guy doesn't mess around. This is why I thought it was really important to watch all the different podcasts that they were involved in leading up into this fight. For example, you had Terrence Crawford show up in the Mike Tyson podcast, same similar fashion as Errol Spence Jr. Now, a lot of people, when they look at these things, they don't really think much of it. They don't think of anything significant as to, well, what do these podcasts really mean other than just promote a fight? To me, one of the things that I look for is the psychology of these fighters. And I thought that it was really important to show that, considering that they're going into a fight where sometimes having one slight mental edge is the difference between winning or losing when it comes to a high level matchup like this. And Terrence Bud Crawford just really had all the ingredients in order for him to perform in the way that he did tonight. Now, I want you guys to take a look at the screen. Obviously, you guys are looking at the screen, right? This is from what I would consider maybe a podcast community or some sort of online chat community. I thought this was really interesting, right? And I'm not putting up this picture, by the way, to slag them off in any kind of way or anything like that. I just thought that it was really interesting the way that they brought up particular numbers. And I think it's really important to understand the lesson that you are not the main character of this storyline that you have cooped up in your head. And I always go back to that particular narrative because it's always true. It's always important to know and understand that, right? And this is what you have right here. So, Pound for Pound Community by the Standing 8 podcast mentioned something to the effect Spence stops Bud in round 7. Spence gets his 29th win because he was going into this fight with his 28 wins. Spence gets his 23rd knockout. Currently, he has 22 knockouts, still does. And you heard it here first. Well, why did you come up with those numbers? Well, because 7 signifies the month that we're in today. 29 is the number of wins that Spence was supposed to have if he was going to win tonight. And 23 was the knockout that he was supposed to get in Terrence Crawford, but it ended up happening to him 2 rounds later. So it sounds like a great story, right? 7, 29, 23. And these are the numbers and stats that went into the fight, but that's not reality. I know that sounds great. That sounds attractive. That sounds like a very good promo to make, but it didn't happen. And ultimately, I think that's really just one of the best things about combat sports is that sometimes we get reality kicked into our face. And by the way, speaking of getting kicked into the face, how about Justin Gaethje head kicking Dustin Poirier in the second round? I'm not surprised by this result, and I'm going to tell you why. Because first and foremost, Dustin Poirier had no attention to detail whatsoever regarding the altitude that he was going to face in Utah. Had no consideration for it whatsoever. Now, what is considered consideration into going into a high altitude matchup like this in Utah? Well, one of the considerations of that is maybe going there a couple of weeks prior before you get into the fight, try to get acclimated, maybe train there or maybe train in high altitude. Guess what? What is the team name that Justin Gaethje trains under? And by the way, shout outs to Jarrell Askew. He trains in that team as well. It's called Team Elevation. So where do they train? They train in Elevation. Now, there is a controversial debate between whether it's good to train up high and then live low, or whether it's good to live up high but train low, right? When it comes to high altitude, there's a big debate about that in the sports science community. So I don't know what is right or what is wrong or what is the correct procedure in that. But The fact of the matter is, if you're training, or I'm sorry, if you're competing under elevation, there's just no way around that. You're going to have to compete under elevation, which means you're going to have to train under elevation, and then you're going to have to get acclimated to the elevation, in which Dustin Poirier did none of it. And Justin Gaethje did all of it in preparation to everything that made this night really tailored for him. So it wasn't really a surprise to me that Dustin Poirier got knocked out and Justin Gaethje came out the victor. So what is the overall theme in understanding that? Look, in this game, it doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your story. It doesn't care about the clout that you have going on. It doesn't care about you being the A side or the B side. And by the way, going back to this Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence fight, that's literally what this is. It is this aspect of, well, we don't really know much about Bud. He comes from a part of town that doesn't have a sports team, and they mention this constantly in the previews and in the promos leading up to the fight. There's no pro teams in Omaha, Nebraska, but guess what? There is a pro fighter that a lot of people get behind in that particular town, and that is Terrence Crawford. He is the guy for that particular town. So in contrast to that, you got Spence Jr., Dallas Cowboys. They love him. They sponsor him. They gave him a platform to fight in their stadium against Mikey Garcia and many other names that have fought in that same arena as well. Manny Pacquiao, Canelo. I think Tyson Fury was going to have a fight there at some point, but never came to fruition. Nonetheless, it's just the reality of combat sports, isn't it? Like, it doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about your story. It doesn't care about the fact that you are the A side or this and that. And by the way, going into this fight, that's all that Spence ever really bragged about was, I'm the A side, man. I'm the A side of this fight. You know, I'm the man. Yeah, this and that. You know, we got to have a highest split. You know, they were talking about splits and who was going to get the higher one and who was going to walk out first. And then they had to make a coin toss about it, which is why I was kind of surprised that Errol Spence was the first guy to come out, right? And why did they let Terrence Crawford come out first? I don't know. Maybe because it was just a coin toss that they had going on. So that was the way that they were going to do it. There was really they really wanted to make a point based on their egos that there was no A side or B side, but I think more so to Errol Spence. And in the end, we found out that Terrence Crawford is the better man. The guy that you underestimated all along was the better guy. And this is something that we have to understand in Terrence Crawford. He is that guy that you picked on in high school. He is that guy that you doubted. He is that guy that came into school with a funky shirt, never had the new shoes coming into class, and was the guy that didn't look much, didn't look like the most presentable person out there, didn't have the best fashion style, didn't have the most witty jokes to say. He was just bland. He was just uninteresting to a lot of people's eyes. Obviously, I don't share these sentiments because if you're a true fight fan and you're a true boxing fan and you're a true mixed martial arts fan, you can't help but admire the skills, not only the skills, but the humanity that's involved in Terrence Crawford, right? He's a family man. He sticks to himself, doesn't go out clubbing. He has tasted a bit of that quote unquote gangster urban life in terms of being shot at before. He's had friends that were about that life, that lived a very dangerous edge to their existence of some sort, right? But nonetheless, the guy is a family guy. He does the right things. He's a Christian. He claims to do all these things for God. So the guy just has one linear path in his in the trajectory of the career and what he wants to do. And leading up to the fight, have you guys seen the Pivot podcast, right? It's a podcast regarding these football players or ex-football players. RC is one of them. If you guys know RC, he's the co-host with DC and the DC RC show on ESPN where they talk about MMA. And RC has a show where with Pivot where he has these ex NFL players and he invites other players and athletes to come in there and talk as well. And he mentions something to the effect where, you know what, to Errol Spence, because they had two guys in there, right? Just like Mike Tyson, he had the two guys in there. He had Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford both in the podcast, right? And then months prior, they had the same thing at the Pivot podcast. So they asked Spence, what are you going to do with a guy that does nothing but eat, breathe, and sleep boxing? Whereas you look at Spence Jr., you look at the type of guys he hangs out with. He hangs out with rappers, right? Of course, Eminem walked out Terrence Crawford tonight, but does Eminem hang out with Terrence Crawford on a daily basis? Does Eminem go to Omaha, Nebraska, even as close as it is to Detroit, and go smoke a blunt with him and do all these things, drink with him, and do all these crazy things that rappers do? No, Terrence Crawford is out there living a life. Now, I don't know if you can say that about Errol Spence Jr. The guy always shows up drunk in every single little function that you see with the PBC or these shows that you see him at, or these events with rappers and, and whatnot. You know what I mean? There's just two different lives that they live. And once again, the talent that Errol Spence had got him this far. It got him to a certain point of, you know what? I'm going to be a world champion. But then when it came down to a fight like this, a magnitude of a Ricky Hatton versus a Floyd Mayweather type of deal, the type of Oscar De La Hoya versus Floyd Mayweather type of fight, all these super fights where you deal with where you deal with the undefeated versus the undefeated, like when Tyson Fury took on Wilder, for example, right? This is where it matters the most. This is where there is a difference between just being good and being talented and then being actually great. And tonight, Terrence Crawford showed that he was great. Now, early in the fight, Terrence Crawford was getting outpointed, I would say, by Errol Spence Jr. And I think just right after that, the second round was the real turnaround. All he had to do was hurt this guy and then stick to a game plan, fight methodically, fight technically, and eventually he was going to get him out of there. I mean, I just witnessed the fight. By the way, as the fight was going on, right, they were announcing Jan Blachowicz and Alex Pereira. And this is when I saw Eminem, and I was like, okay, let me turn down the UFC side, right? Because Eminem was walking out with Terrence Crawford. I was like, oh man, this is exciting, right? So as that was going on, I noticed the fear that Errol Spence had in his face, in which I've never seen him in his previous fights with, let's say, Mikey Garcia, Danny Garcia, or Ugas, or anyone else. Certainly not the same type of fear that I saw when he fought Kell Brook. He just looked afraid. You know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of when Conor McGregor fought Khabib back in 2018. There was this uneasy look in in Conor's face when he knew he was about to go fight Khabib. And that was the same thing that I saw and noticed with none other than Spence tonight. It was just like, wow, there is an uneasy feeling where he knew something was up, where he felt unprepared, or he knew that this guy was going to be a problem. I mean, for goodness sakes, it's Terrence Crawford. But on the other side of that, you don't think that perhaps Terrence Crawford was feeling the same way? Right? But he knew something up his sleeve that Errol Spence didn't. Errol Spence just was really unsure and insecure about his standings going into this fight. Now, two comparisons within these two events that I wanted to mention. First, you have Nonito Donaire, right? Losing tonight, and then you had Tony Ferguson. They looked like exactly who they were. Nonito Donaire and Tony Ferguson. They looked like exactly who they were as the fight was progressing, but then they looked a lot older as the fight was progressing, and then eventually getting the type of loss that they both had. I mean, look, with Tony Ferguson, it looked like he was about to pull off some sort of a moral victory of some sort, right? Because the way that Bobby Green had that arm triangle locked in, I thought that, like, you know what? Maybe perhaps he's going to survive this at some point and just get a moral victory, right? Just come out with another decision. Lo and behold, he ends up going to sleep and the referee stopping the fight, rightfully so, the way that they did. And of course, now this is like within, six losses in a row. What is the UFC going to do? Look, this is my take on why the UFC is keeping Tony Ferguson. Obviously, he is a fan-friendly fighter. He does have a certain following. You see the type of pop that he got in the Utah crowd. You know that the guy was a star and a hardcore fight fans fighter. But the problem with Tony Ferguson is that he's just in a situation where he is too tough for his own good. And I think Khabib is influencing the UFC in some sort of way to say, you know what? Give Tony a chance, because maybe Khabib felt bad that he never gave him that money fight that he felt like he deserved, right? He never got that. He never got that money fight in terms of during the pandemic or before the pandemic. It was Khabib and Tony Ferguson that were supposed to fight in April. And then March came around, they canceled everything. So that means they had to cancel the entire card. So the April card never came about. And then they had to wait a month later in May to go into a Jacksonville card. And then lo and behold, it was Justin Gaethje who stepped in to fight Tony Ferguson and then made Tony Ferguson look like the Tony Ferguson that you see today. And that was the trajectory of his career from there. Now, yeah, I mentioned Derek Lewis tonight with his, knockout win. Who else was in this card tonight, in this illustrious card that constantly, by the way, I want to make a comment about 2023, right? Would you say that 2023 at the current moment is probably one of the best combat sports years there is? Right? You look at all the title fights that we've had going on. You look at all the big fights that we have with Spence and Crawford tonight. And then you had Garcia and what's his name? Tank Davis. Now you have Tyson Fury taking on Francis Ngannou. All these situations, all these different like matchups that we have going on, right? Like, it's a pleasure to live in this particular era of combat sports, because not only are you getting all the top fights that you want in terms of meritocracy and the best fighting the best, but in the midst of that, you're also getting all these freak show fights like Jake Paul, who's always in a freak show fight, but now brings in even more of a freak show fight situation with none other than who? Guess who? Nate Diaz. And when is that? Next week. After that, what's after that? Another rematch with Dylan White and Anthony Joshua. And by the way, I add that as one of the big fights of 2023 among the big fights that are out there. In fact, that fight is probably a better fight than Danny Dubois taking on Alexander Usyk, in which Alexander Usyk is basically fighting him as just some sort of mandatory of some sort. But nonetheless, yeah, the reason why I think Anthony Joshua and Dylan White are a great fight. And by the way, check out my one of my recent videos, by the way, talking about a part 2 series of the gangster persona lifestyle that Dylan White and Anthony Joshua lived under. Now, is it real? Is it persona? Who's more real and who is doing it more for persona? What is that particular relationship dealing with Anthony Joshua as this mainstream star with all these publications and public relations team on top of the marketing that's behind him? What does all that mean? Right? Well, prior to that, in 2015, when they were just fighting for international titles, Commonwealth titles, and British titles, which were the titles that were up for grabs when Dylan White and Anthony Joshua fought. It was a much simpler time, right? And I think that that's the kind of treat that you're going to get out of AJ in the O2 Arena fighting Dylan White for the second time, is going back to the simpler times before he was champion, before he had to do all these high media obligations during the Vladimir Klitschko fight and the time of which they were doing all these stadium fights in Wales and whatnot. Now he gets to kind of dial it down a little bit, and on top of that, improve his skills with the new trainers that he has with none other than Derek James. Speaking of Derek James, I was thinking to myself, what could this particular fight tonight mean for Anthony Joshua's coaching with Derek James? It could probably mean absolutely nothing, because a lot of people like to take stock into, oh, well, because this coach lost this big fight, it means that his coaches, it means that the fighters that he coaches underneath maybe are going to suffer the same thing. Well, you look at John Kavanagh and you look at the fights that he's had as a coach with Conor McGregor, and you would probably think, well, okay, maybe Conor McGregor is not in such a hot streak in the way that he probably needs to be with the type of big name that he has. Okay, maybe that's fair. Maybe that's true. But then on the lower side of that, you look at John Kavanagh. He's got a lot of fighters that are in Brave FC. He's got fighters that are in Bellator. He's got fighters that are in the local Irish amateur and pro scene. He's got fighters everywhere. And so you can't really put too much stock into what one coach does in one fight over the other. So in other words, you can't really put too much stock into Derek James's coaching relationship with Anthony Joshua in conjunction with Errol Spence's performance tonight, because very well we could have seen probably the best welterweight in the entire history of boxing tonight, none other than Terence Crawford. That could have been the absolute reality of all things tonight. So that is one thing to consider amongst all these things. Now, how about the Alex Pereira and Jan Blachowicz fight? This was really interesting because this fight was going on while the Errol Spence and Terence Crawford fight were just concluding, right? And as they were concluding, just right as Terence Crawford and Errol Spence were going to fight, Joe Rogan was already in the cage with Justin Gaethje getting the BMF belt. Now, Jorge Masvidal didn't exactly wrap the belt around Justin Gaethje, because Justin Gaethje said prior to this fight something to the effect of, well, I kind of wanted Jorge Masvidal to wrap it around my waist because it was a lot more bittersweet, considering that he is a training partner of Dustin Poirier, and it's like a big slap in their face, so I kind of feel good about it. Something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing what he said, and that's not the exact words, but that's the idea behind it. Nonetheless, like, what is this? Let's see here. Alex Pereira and yeah, so okay, Alex Pereira had no takedowns in this particular fight, yet Jan Blachowicz was able to lose this fight. And again, this is like the new criteria of mixed martial arts scoring, right? Takedowns don't win you the fights. There's times where it does. There's a moment of era in MMA, especially in a George St. Pierre era, that you could say that, but not in today's era, obviously. Alex Pereira had more of the significant strikes going into this fight, 112 out of 138. So that's an 81% total strike. Significant was at 76%. And the submission attempts, Jan had a little bit more, but Alex Pereira was controlling the range. He was just getting off some shots, and that's ultimately what won him the fight, even with the 3 takedowns that Jan Blachowicz was able to do. But out of those 3 takedowns, he had to attempt it 3 times and was only successful 3 out of the 8. Right? So I could see why the judges sort of sided with Alex Pereira on this particular card. And then with Bobby Green and Tony Ferguson. These are the stats that they had going on. There was no submission. There was one submission attempt with Bobby Green in which he was able to finish Tony Ferguson last time out. Now, what is the UFC going to do with Tony Ferguson in this particular matter? I mean, look, there was literally only 6 seconds left into that particular card. I mean, that particular fight. And then he just gave up just like that. But I mean, Tony Ferguson said that he was going to come out here and become this world champion, right? He was going to go on this run. Look, here's something you got to understand about fighters, right? Fighters are the biggest liars to themselves and to others. Okay, because number one, they got to lie to other people because they have to sell you tickets. They have to sell you the idea that they're the greatest guys in the world. They have to sell to their opponents that they are that guy so that they can scare them to oblivion into some sort of psychological warfare that is an advantage for them. And then they have to lie to themselves when their bodies are just not in the prime state that they once were. So they have to lie to themselves. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? Obviously, you look at Glover Teixeira, how it took him far at 40 some odd years of age, becoming a world champion. And even Michael Bisping winning at a later part of his career, a later part of his life. But this is the reality of combat sports, right? You never leave it in a very pleasant manner. And in BJ Penn is an example of that. Chuck Liddell, not so much with Tito Ortiz, although he did take a few hard losses at the end. But nonetheless, everybody that one of your favorite fighters from the legendary days of Pride and the older days of the UFC, this is the reality and the trajectory in which they are going to face. So I don't know what to say about Tony Ferguson and what the UFC is going to do from here. I would imagine that somewhere in Tuesday time, you see that they have these websites where they have roster watch or something like that. I think there's somebody on Twitter, something of like UFC roster watch, and they usually like release the names of the people that got kicked out or cut from the UFC. And I can only imagine that Tony is going to be one of them. And I think that it's going to be a big shocker. And then you're going to see a lot of different YouTubers make videos about it. Oh, Tony Ferguson, this is the end of the road. And somewhere down the line, Tony Ferguson is either going to get picked up by BKFC or some other regional game out there, regional MMA organization, or perhaps maybe someone overseas, or maybe even Ramzan Kadyrov in the AECB. Maybe him and Khabib can finally do it there, or maybe do it behind closed doors, but who knows? But moving on with the card, you had Michael Chiesa taking on Kevin Holland. Now, in this particular fight, this is one of those situations where Kevin Holland had to rock Mike Chiesa in order for him to get the submission attempts, and then for him to stuff 5 of Mike Chiesa's takedown attempts, and for him to have the better striking in this, the much more accurate striking, for him to land the shots that he did in order for him to grab onto the Darce choke that he caught Mike Chiesa in. Great fight for Kevin Holland, a first round finish just like that. I mean, the guy is active, right? When you got a guy that's this active, look, the reality of these type of guys, guess what? They're going to have moments where they're going to get finished in the first round by the likes of Khamzat Chimaev, which you've seen happen to Kevin Holland. But then they constantly build up this experience getting in the octagon and just learning from these mistakes that they just keep getting better and better, to where now they take on somebody who's a veteran like Mike Chiesa and gets this surprising result. So good job on the part of Kevin Holland on this one. And then these are the fights that were canceled. Obviously, Stephen Thompson was supposed to fight Michel Pereira, but because of the fact that Michel Pereira didn't make weight by 3 pounds, Stephen Thompson just decided, I'm just not going to take this fight. And here's the thing. A lot of people are going to call Stephen Thompson a coward. They're going to call him a punk for making this decision. But I can tell you this. It's not in the ethos of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to be like, well, I am the BMF of the entire UFC, right? In fact, he's not. He's actually the opposite. He's the NMF, the nice MFer out there in terms of the quintessential contrasting opposite of what a BMF is. So, therefore, he's not going to take short notice fights. He's not going to take calculated risks, knowing that statistically, people who have had miss weight often end up winning because of the lack of starvation and the lack of dehydrating they're doing to themselves. It's obviously giving them some sort of performance enhancement in comparison to all these other guys in the card that are draining themselves to make 155, 170 for Kevin Holland. And then you had Derek Lewis losing a little bit of weight, but okay, he's a heavyweight. Not that that matters. The, Jan Blachowicz having to cut weight from being a heavyweight, and Alex Pereira really barely cutting any weight at all because he just walks around at 220. So a 15-pound difference was enough for him to walk into fight camp and into fight week with a short amount of time for him to just cut the small amount of weight that he needs to make 205. And then the results spoke for themselves. He was able to do something that his rival Izzy couldn't do, which was beat Jan. But the way that Jan beat Izzy was just based on the wrestling that I guess, even Alex Pereira couldn't stop. But the scoring criteria in this was different in that regard. Now, early into the night, you had Miranda Maverick getting a submission win. Matthew Sellenberger getting a TKO in the third. Getting TKO'd in the third round by Orcus Medic. And in the prelims, you had Roman Kopylov getting a TKO win over Claudio Ribeiro. And great call out for him on Sean Strickland. He said, I want the gangster Sean Strickland. He's real gangster and this and that. I like that matchup for him right there. But I think it's great for Roman, but not good for Sean Strickland, because Sean Strickland is right up there, right? Suppose Dricus is the main guy that they want, and why would he not be, right? With the kind of beef that him and Israel Adesanya are brewing up, why would you not want that fight if you're the UFC and you want to make loads and loads of money, right? Well, here's the thing. If let's say Sean Strickland was to take this challenge against Roman, and by the way, Sean Strickland is a crazy enough guy to take that. He's like, I don't give a damn. Yeah, I'm number 2. I can wait for a title shot, but I'm going to go in there and get a title shot anyway. I'm going to go in there and beat this guy, man. That's literally his attitude into this. And tomorrow he would sign the papers to fight Roman Kopylov if you called him bluff or you pull this punk card on it. He would absolutely do it. But that's good for Roman Kopylov and not good for Sean Strickland, because then he would just be risking a title defense. A title shot and a title defense from Izzy, for which he probably wants to defend it against Dricus. But now they canceled the Sean Strickland fight, but yet Sean Strickland is still up there in the top 3 of the division of some sort, right? So great call out by Roman Kopylov and great knockout win for him on that. Jake Matthews, how about this? Jake Matthews literally got a knockout and a submission all rolled into one fight. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, he kicked them in the stomach, right? Like straight into the gut. And then the way that the referee called it, it was a little too low. So they somehow had to reset the fight. And then Jake Matthews just ended up choking him out even right afterwards. Right. So it's a great win if you really think about it, right? A type of win where you get not only a knockout TKO, but then you get a submission on top of that. I mean, for that alone, he should somehow get some kind of compensation. And then Gabriel Bonfim getting a first round submission against Trevin Giles. By the way, Trevin Giles decided that he was going to retire from the Houston Police Department in order for him to concentrate on his career full time. Now, what's great about Trevin Giles is he has a great career even outside of the UFC. If he decided he wanted to go back into the police force, he could do that. But he retired prematurely so that he can concentrate on his mixed martial arts career. But it became a little bit too late, because then you had Gabriel Bonfim, a guy who's 15-0 in the welterweight division. I mean, look, this is a guy who probably doesn't have work, doesn't have anything to worry about other than train. And look, here's the thing, right? Sean Strickland, by the way, speaking of him, he brought up something very interesting, right? He says that the U.S. guys are getting paid way less than, let's say, the Dagestani guys or the Brazilian guys or all these other MMA fighters that come from, let's say, a little less privileged countries and whatnot, right? And he says that the American fighters are getting underpaid because of the cost of living that we have here in comparison to, let's say, the Dagestanis or the Brazilians that may not have the same living arrangements that we have in America or in the Western world, right? So that makes a whole lot of sense, right? Because Gabriel, that's all that he really does. Whereas Trevin Giles, I mean, for goodness sakes, this guy was since 2017 a Houston Police Department member as a cop and was fighting in the UFC full time while doing 12-hour shifts as a police officer and then just getting by the UFC, getting by his police career, all while doing that. And he just decided one day, you know what, I'm just going to pick one or the other. I'm just going to go with MMA. I'm going to go train full time and I'm going to see where that takes me. And then this is the ending result of that. So, great job on Gabriel Bonfim. I don't think this really says a lot about Trevin Giles because of a loss. Gabriel, I mean, look at him. He's 15-0. Goodness knows where he's going to be in the welterweight division and division, by the way, that just constantly continues to stack up competition after competition. The likes of Colby, the likes of Usman. Then you have Khamzat jumping in the mix between 185 to 170 and then making 170 even interesting. Now you have Mike Chiesa, who's 170. He was before a 155er. Now you have Kevin Holland beating Mike Chiesa. Now Kevin Holland gets in the mix and, you know, Usman is still there and Leon is the champion. And then, of course, you have Bilal Muhammad. And then you have Wonder Boy Thompson. Goodness can only know how good he would have looked tonight. And then we move on to CJ Varaga taking on Vinicius Salvador. Now, during the fight, I noticed that the announcers and the commentators are saying something to the effect of how they look like they were in a sparring situation and not really going for broke. Well, look, here's something you got to understand, right? Yes, Salvador missed weight, and they were mentioning something to the effect, well, okay, you know what? They had to charge him this amount of money because of the missed weight that he has, but they felt that it wasn't enough punishment. The announcers and the commentators said, they were like, yeah, you got to go in there and you got to punish this guy. Now, again, I think this is the conclusion of the high altitude and the output that these guys were doing. Now, if you notice how Jan got tired in a fight, a couple of guys got tired in between the fights. This is normal. You're fighting in high elevation. It's going to happen. But guess what? You're going to have to try to take preventative measures. And maybe sometimes you're going to fight a little bit differently. Maybe you're going to fight a little more methodically. Maybe you're going to fight a little bit more carefully. But that's just really what it is. That's just the reality of the situation that you deal with when you are in that in that category of fighting in high elevation. But nonetheless, what a great night of fights that we've had overall, both on the boxing side and the UFC side. And guess what? The party just keeps on rolling every week, every day, and every time a new fight gets announced. Because guess what? After this week, next week, it's Sanhagen taking on Rob Font. Rob Font stepping in for Umar. And by the way, this is the same day that they're going to have the Nate Diaz and Jake Paul boxing match, right? So Jessica Andrade is in that card taking on Tatiana Suarez at 10-0. Okay, and then obviously all the different cards that are coming up after that. You have Luque versus Dos Anjos on the 12th, which is probably going to be an Apex card. I think next week it's going to be a Jacksonville card or a Nashville card, rather. And Dos Anjos and Luque on the 12th. Then you have UFC 292 in August 19th. Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley. Weili Zhang taking on Amanda Lemos. I guess that's the co-main event now. They were working on something there, but I don't know what happened. And then you have Cody Garbrandt taking on Mario Batista. Ian Gary coming off of his win against Daniel Rodriguez and then coming in here against Jeff O'Neill. Marlon Vera in the mix against Pedro Munoz. And who else is in here? Andre Petrosky, Gerald Mershad, Andrea Lee. Okay, it's a bunch of unknowns. Chris Weidman, how about that? Against Brad Tavares as the main event for the prelim portion of the card before they go into the main card, or the main pay-per-view at 7 p.m. Western time. So that is all that we have for the fights tonight. I enjoyed the fights. I hope you guys enjoyed the fights. It was a great night to be a fan of the sport and to observe both. I mean, look, it's one of those situations where some people had to pick one. They were just going to concentrate and pick one. And then some people were just interested in one. And then there were people like me who were interested in both, that didn't want to miss both and wanted to be there to see all of it. And here we are. I was glad to be a part of it, glad to have witnessed it, but more importantly, glad to have covered it. Thank you. Hope you guys have a good night. Enjoy the rest of your weekends and enjoy the next week and enjoy the fights that continue carrying on in 2023 and beyond.